My name is Kate Hilton. I'm delighted to spend some time with you to talk about the psychology of change. I wanted to start just simply by introducing myself. These are my parents. My dad was born in 1926. He was born in Madison, Wisconsin. He grew up during the Great Depression in a Catholic family of 6. He was drafted right out of high school into World War II, and he served as a pharmacy mate at a naval hospital in Corvallis, Oregon, seeing casualties out of the Pacific. After the war, went back to Madison, where he played football for the Wisconsin Badgers, boxed, ran track, but he also became a doc and trained at the Mayo and became the 11th doctor on staff at the Dean Clinic, the first surgeon, and worked at the Sisters of St. Mary's Hospital, where he trained surgeons in Madison. This was also in sort of the heyday when he was a thoracic surgeon, a general surgeon, and got to work on babies. So it was like, you know, the heyday of innovation and moving towards much more specialized care. My mom was a Missouri farm girl. She was born 15 years after my dad, also to a big Catholic family, turkey farm in a tiny rural part of Missouri. And out of her high school days, went into college and became a nurse. She also became a Franciscan nun. So the hospital was run by the Sisters of St. Mary's, and that's where my mother and father met. And it's a good thing for me that my mom decided she could love God and my dad. So I grew up, the product of healthcare. Lived in a very privileged part of Madison, was able to walk in and out of my front door with it open, had evening meals that my father would make an effort to get home for and then go back to do rounds after if he needed to. Heard many stories about patients and providers, and always thought, for sure I would find my way to healthcare as a doc. But my path turned slightly when I got into community organizing as a young adult, and I worked with Marshall Gans, who's a longtime community organizer, was a sort of the right hand of Cesar Chavez in the farm workers movement. And I was at Harvard Divinity School, and so then I began working with him and went on to get into law and look at both the civic and the moral side of leadership, and how that's expressed and how people come around their values to make decisions around their interests, to exercise their assets together, to combine in new ways to create change. And so my work in health has largely been to teach and train people in the principles and methods and practice of movement building, of community organizing, of ways to collaborate, to combine, to create power to achieve an outcome. So where I wanted to take my story next was to my kids. So last fall, my son Hans and my son Hugo, I live in Hanover, New Hampshire, but I had to get them home to Madison to see a football game so they knew where they were really from. And so we had a great weekend, and right before we were to leave, we were playing at the playground, and my son was on the jungle gym, and you can imagine he had a little fall and he broke his arm. So my older son Hans had a pretty serious break, and we went, of course, right in. Very fortunate for us, again, being sort of privileged members of the Madison medical community. The head of the Children's Hospital at the UW literally paved a way for our family. He had been trained by my father, and so that allowed us to get outstanding care from Dr. Kenneth Noonan, who fixed up Hans's arm with his team in surgery in a jiffy. We had one overnight stay in the hospital, and that was that. And the reason I'm telling you this story about my son, in addition to the fact that it's really nice for me always to talk about my family, is that I wanted to just make this point about adaptive versus technical change, okay? And a lot of the expert in this is Ronald Heifetz at Harvard at the Kennedy School. He talks about adaptive leadership. You can look that up if you're really interested in learning more. But the idea of, when Hans broke his arm, we were dealing with a very technical problem, that we had specialists who dedicated their careers to solving, to knowing their part on a team to help make him well. It was clear we had experts, and man, that fix happened quickly, and we needed it too. The healthcare system fully delivered for us in every possible way. But what we also experienced was that when we got home, Hans had to learn how to put his shirt on now. He had to learn how to eat differently, how to sit at the table, how to study at school, what things he could not do at recess, even how to sleep. Hans had a cast. He was in a twin bed, and he kept rolling out of bed because of the weight of the cast, which of course you don't want him to do with the broken bone. So we moved him immediately. The quick fix, It's clear. Let's get him into the queen size guest bed, right? So we moved him to the guest bed, but guess who couldn't sleep? His little brother Hugo, who had never not slept in the same room as his older brother Hans. Hugo was waking up 5, 6, 8 times a night. Then who else was waking up? Mom was waking up 8 times a night. Then who was waking up? Dad was waking up 8 times a night. The system around Hans, right, the people with the problem that needed to sort of solve it and keep it solved had to figure out some PDSAs quickly about how to make that work. That guest bed was not going to be the solution. Let's figure out how to get them back in the same room, put a mattress on the floor, right? So this is what we do every day when we encounter any type of change. We are thinking about sometimes how to quickly fix it, and this is what the healthcare system has been designed for. This is what we want it to do when it does what it does well for patients. And there is a lot of adaptive learning that goes on for staff in creating any type of technical change. So just to bring that back to your settings, right? This is an example that comes to us from Florence, South Carolina. This is Dr. Michael Rose. He was the VP of Surgical Services. In 2009, he was hot to trot on the technical solution of the surgical safety checklist, right? This was a no-brainer technical fix. And he said, great, everyone will just pick this up and adopt it. You know how that story goes, right? How easy has it been to adopt anything like a checklist in your setting? What do you encounter? What did we talk about with Joe? A tremendous amount of resistance. And Joe talked about multiple approaches, right? There's many ways to many. We need awareness building and will building, and we need behavior change. We're gonna even get the CEO to say, you know what? This is a mandate. You must all use it. Adoption rates, even after the mandate, hovered at 30%, right? Because people are like, this is my OR, I'm doing things my way. But guess what? It wasn't just ego. It was also a real sense of responsibility for the patient. Like, look, at the end, the buck stops with me, and I need to ensure that this is how it works, and I'm scared of trying something differently or communicating differently because I don't know what that holds. There's fear. There's frustration, right? And so what he decided was that he, in fact, this very technical change, this great idea that we want to bring from the evidence and bring to bear, when we engage people in the work of collaborating to get there, so many of the things we talked about this morning start bubbling up. So I want to start just by inviting you guys to share with one another what human side of change or adaptive barriers to change, where the people, the staff, for example, in the surgical safety checklist, they had a bunch of their own challenges that they faced in trying to figure out how to work together to get it done. In your settings, how do you encounter those challenges? What are some you're facing right now? Let's just take a couple minutes to chat with your table. So, what did we identify? What were some of the barriers that you guys are encountering with other wonderful human beings with whom you work? Shout them out.
Policy doesn't support change.
Okay. Policy is opposing what we're trying to get done. System level barriers. Yes?
Implement change because it's decades since it was implemented, and on paper it's still 99% use, and in the real world it's about to half, maybe.
Yeah.
And the biggest barrier was actually the culture of the craft of surgery, and so even with a few places that had a sort of multimodal approach to change, you still had a kind of car crash into the fact that this is my practice area, I do all of this, someone else might need to think about it, it's not for us. And so I think that 10 years to where we've got now since implementation represents a cultural shift rather than useful application of improvement.
Yep, great. Thank you. That's very helpful. Yes?
I think also with the surgical safety checklist, I mean, we actually have experts for the surgeons, the American College of Surgeons didn't take a position with the surgical safety checklist, and it set up when you have AORN for nursing, and they're like, well, we're not going to listen to AORN around how to do certain things or who, and they don't have their own society supporting them. It sets up a antagonistic, and you know what I mean, kind of.
Great. Yep. I'm going to give you guys some others because this is an endless list that we could create together today, right? Everything that you've named and then some in terms of what we encounter when we bring to bear these great change ideas with one another. And we talked already a little bit about fear and how that shows up, but we actually asked you guys in a pre-survey, hey, Alex. Oh, Alex is I need to just stop and introduce Alex. So Alex Anderson is a research associate with innovation. You heard from Mara yesterday about the innovation team's work. Alex and I are a team of two, mighty team of two that work to develop the Psychology of Change white paper. And Alex and I co-authored that, and so I'm so glad he's here today also as a resident expert in the psychology of change who you should get to know and tap. So Alex, thank you. So here's what you guys said. So the first and foremost was competing demands on people's time, okay? And the second was opposition to change, and then we saw lack of leadership, power struggles, maintaining motivation, and too much change at once, just from what you said in your initial survey. Marshall, he always challenges me around that first one, around competing demands on people's time, and he says, you know what, Kate, and pardon my French, that's just bullshit. And I'll say, what? And he'll say, no, because everybody has the same amount of time. And so it's how you prioritize your time, right? That is how you spend it, right? And so our job as change agents is to help people prioritize their time around the things that need to happen, including the change efforts that we're taking forward with them on the basis, and we're going to talk a lot about this today, of their intrinsic motivation. But he would say that idea of a competing demand of time is just sort of a way to hide around people's resistance. That in fact, underneath the idea that I don't have time is there's something else going on under the hood. And it's important not to just take that at face value, but look what's underneath and help people explore what's happening that's not giving you that amount of time, right? And how could this really matter to you so that this was a priority? So just wanted to note that because that always rings for me when I see this. So why does it matter that we would spend some time together to talk about this at all? Why do you guys, I heard from Simon very generously that you're pumped about this session. So why should we talk about psychology of change? And why is it fundamental?
Because for human behaviors, the psychology influences behavior. Psychology is the inner side, behavior is the outside side, so it's connected.
Yeah, right. And why does it matter to us as healthcare professionals?
I think one of them, especially if you're coming to this and you're working in improvement,
yeah.
Probably our biggest frustration is like trying to make things happen and it doesn't happen.
Yeah.
And seeing that human side of it and thinking, why are people just not doing this?
Yeah.
Because it's deeply frustrating.
Yeah. And what is on the line for us? What is on the line? Sometimes our jobs, yeah, we might have deliverables about improvement, so it could be a very, clear motivation on the basis of reward. People's lives, right? People's lives. So it matters because of what Joe was talking about, like the scaling problem, right? We know what to do. We have an evidence base that is enormous, and yet we have an implementation failure. And that is dissonant to us as human beings. Why is that? Why is that dissonant to us? Why does that bother you? You are an improver for a reason. Where does that come from? We're going to explore that today. I'm going to offer that I think the first and foremost reason is because we are beings capable of love. Because we love people. We love our family members. We love our neighbors and our friends. We love our patients. We love our teammates. And when they're in that hospital bed, when it's their turn or it's our turn, boy, we just want to outlove, right? And we want to do what's right. And giving that sort of sense of meaning and purpose to us around helping others out of a sense of our own values for love. The second is what Joe talked about when he invoked Doris Lessing. When he read her words, we know more about ourselves today than people did in the past, and yet very little of that knowledge is being put into use. And he said it hit him squarely between the eyes. That was his value of justice. That is wrong, right? As change agents, as improvers, we are often compelled from a sense of love and a sense of justice. And that comes from something inside of each of us. Somewhere in your own story, someone role modeled what it looks like to love, what it looks like to fight for justice. And that's in you. And that's somewhere part of your story about why you do the work that you do. We're going to explore that when we talk about unleashing intrinsic motivation. So this is, to me, that love and justice is what sits squarely between why we try to bridge this gap between what we know and what we do. And, and it's really hard to keep up. And Joe really hit this point home and talked about the diffusion of innovation curve, which I know you're all very familiar with. What I'd like for you to now sort of blow up your mind around this curve, and I want you to imagine this curve not as a mathematical, scientific, healthcare-oriented, beautiful diffusion of innovation curve. I want you to imagine it as a set of emojis. Because what is happening is people feel something about the change. The early adopters, right, the innovators, they love change. They are ready for it. But everybody else has a different set of feelings along the way. And that's normal because when you look at this, think about the times someone told you to change. How did you feel about it when you live here? Could have been your mother. Could have been your boss, right? Could have been your own kid. And when someone tells us how to, what to do, as Joe had alluded to, this is uncomfortable for us. The reason I'm asking you to feel what that, to invoke in yourself what that feels like to resist change is because when we're trying to get people to join us, boy, we want to have some empathy for what it's like to resist. Because it's human. Because it's normal. We should expect that, right? So that's part of our work, is to become experts in how people feel in response to change and how to manage that. Because just like the stages of grief, which many of you have been trained in if you're in the medical profession or the nursing profession, people experience stages, a psychological set of stages as they go through change. The first is one of shock or denial. It doesn't need to change. It's always been this way. What do you mean? Why would it ever have to change, right? Now, some people are not so naive to stay long in denial and recognize lots of things need fixing. But instead of denying that change might need to happen, they may say, well, but I don't like how that feels. And our work is to really explore with people where that resistance comes from and understand it so that we can move them from resistance to exploration. And these feelings, fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of loss of reputation, of turf, of power, of ego, of anything, right? This is, I would say, kind of most of what we want to kind of put our arms around. And not in a running away from fear way, but in an embracing of fear way. Joe's partner, Becky, at the Billions Institute, calls this hugging the bear. And I just love this. I really love this metaphor. She talks about like the bear being the big scary thing that's coming running at you. And she said, when you have fear, the best you can do is just get your arms around it and hug that bear. And the idea is that we can't make it go away, but we just have to see it and welcome it and explore it and move with it towards the next stage, which is exploration. Right? The idea that what is the first thing, like if you're feeling a barrier to change, well, what is that barrier? What might be a way to explore that barrier? What is a possibility? What's one PDSA you might test? How could we get someone on the train with us and ask them to own a little part of that solution based on what they see? When, we've talked about thinking like a systems thinker. Well, each person in any one of our innovation projects is part of that system. And hearing, moving past our own bias to how they might imagine taking that change, even past what some of the evidence has to say and going to what Joe was discussing around adaptiveness. What part do we have to really hold tight to and where can we play? Where can we play jazz and improvise? And then from there, if we get enough going on exploration, we should begin to move over that diffusion of innovation curve about how people feel about it. Not to say there won't be setbacks, not to say that there isn't sort of a dynamic iteration here. We want to invite you to think about a couple mindset shifts as you lead improvement work in your settings with your colleagues and you address the adaptive barriers that you identified this morning. And the first one is resistance is good. It's good because, first of all, it means we've moved out of shock and denial, at least into resistance, right? And now we have something to engage. Now, is it tiring to do that? Yeah. So there's something we also have to do within ourselves, as I would say, like a fundamental precursor, which is to be ready and to be waiting and to be engaged in the presence it's going to take to be in the resistance, right? That's something we should expect. But we should also think about, this gives us a chance to explore what's possible, to move to that exploration with people. And you know what it's like when someone comes at you, right? When someone is, when you're pushing against somebody else's resistance, that results in a dead end. The idea is that we want to work with that resistance. We want to do what Derek talks about, a lot of inquiry, listening, exploring. Does that take time? Does that save time? It does. So people get frustrated here because they say, boy, Kate, that means I really have to spend a lot of time early on talking to people, learning about them, trying to figure out what they value and why. Mike Rose, after 18 months of investing his hospital resources in that surgical safety checklist and all his other ideas, right? They got nowhere. They wasted all those resources trying what they always had tried. Bless you. And instead, when he changed course and he started listening and engaging people and building relationships one at a time, it saved a tremendous amount of resource and it resulted in success. So we have sort of this idea that takes too long. In fact, it saves us tremendous resource in the long run. The second is what Joe said to us, and I just pull straight from him and Becky, which is that we need to move from, I know what the solution is, here's what the paper says, here's our fidelity to the model, to, okay, here's something we think is a good idea for us. Now, let's explore what we all think about that, right? What's possible? What do we see as the possibilities? Who could help us with that? And so changing it from what we want everyone to do and telling them, which we're used to doing in sort of the hierarchy and management of healthcare, to this idea of eliciting from them. This is a fundamental shift from compliance to commitment. A fundamental shift from compliance to commitment. We're going to talk a little more about that as well. The third is that your people, that you've got with you, those early adopters, are improvement gold. So even though we're dealing with resistance, and we're going to, navigate that, boy, we never want to lose sight of the people we already have and our work around their psychology and sustaining their motivation, their relationships with each other, their support of the co-design and the distribution of power that we can do with them to get started and start adapting and figuring it out. So just an acknowledgement that, like, whatever assets you already have, that's where our energy is going to come from, so that we are sustained in the work, which is important if you're going to be able to encounter resistance day in, day out. So as you know, and I'm sure you've explored this week, what we're doing here is a little talk about the psychology side of the system of profound knowledge, which interacts, of course, with all of the other lenses all at once in any improvement project, and even in the exploration of psychology. And what Deming had to say about it was that he recognized that people were our fundamental source of value, that we had, as improvers, an obligation to understand psychology as part of the work of understanding the appreciation of a system, or knowledge of variation, or theory of knowledge, if we were going to succeed in improvement. And the technical side of improvement, a lot of the tools that we teach at IHI and beyond live here. And it's only in the last couple of years that we decided to sort of see and look around at what else people have been saying and doing elsewhere as improvers, or in other applied methods and fields of psychology, sociology, and then many beyond. And where some of the highest leverage tools are for improvers, so that we could get better at this, right? And pay more exquisite attention to where, as Joe said, 70% of our improvement work fails. Is not because the evidence isn't there, but because we can't get people to work together to get it done, right? So let's invest a lot more of our time in how we build our own expertise in working with people. And so psychology of change is simply our work in the art and science of human behavior, feelings, how people respond to change as part of the transformation journey in improvement. And just to give you kind of a background on our work with the psychology of change, started with a huge literature review across, again, sociology, psychology, but many different applied methods, coming from design thinking, scaling up, Joe's work, adaptive leadership, behavior change, organizational development. How many of you, when you see this slide, something up here is familiar to you already? You already know some of these tools, right? Start there. You already know some of these tools. Start with the assets you have. Ask the people on your team, what do they know about? Invite them to use those assets in creating, those methods and tools in creating, success in your improvement work. Because look, this is the human stuff, right? This is stuff, a lot of this stuff is stuff that we've done forever. Telling stories, building relationships, creating shared purpose. Right? PDSAs, come on, we learned PDSAs when we learned how to walk, talk, right? This is the stuff of being human. What these folks do is we're just getting intentional. We're paying more exquisite attention and intention to how we do this with people as part of any other improvement method, okay? And what we found at the core of these applied methods was a sort of a fundamental principle around activating people's agency. What folks were after in this crosswalk of tools was the ability of individuals and groups to choose to act with purpose. And that, sort of, if you think from a driver diagram standpoint, where does that come from? What does it take for agency to exist? And it takes two things. It takes power, or the ability to act with purpose. That definition is given to us by Martin Luther King Jr. Simply the ability of an individual group to act with purpose is our power. And we have to have the capability to create change, right? Some of that may mean we need improvement science to help us do that. That is a part of our ability, right? But just because we have the power doesn't mean that we use it. Thus, that gap. We also have to have courage, or the emotional resources, to choose to act in the first place, to exercise our power. And of course, we can have courage and blindly start, doing things without true ability. So we're going to need both. And the work of the psychology of change is to help us as improvers think about how we're going to build some power and how we're going to build some courage in our people to exercise agency, to commit to change. And that's where the psychology of change lives in William Bridges' transition curve. But we want to be moving people from resistance into exploration through a variety of domains. And these domains happen at the level of the self, of the us, and of the system, right? So we have our own individual agency that gets activated. I mean, you can think of a time when someone inspired you to act, right? Or you chose to be here, right? How that occurred, your agency to make that choice. The second is the collective agency of your teams or your departments or your the people improving with you acting together, which is what we're most often doing in our improvement work at the level of the interpersonal. And then the last is the system. And what I would note about the system, right, is that its structures, processes, conditions, policies, these are all created by humans. These are all created by humans. And so that means that it is happening at the interpersonal to create the structures and processes, and they can be changed. So those things can be affected by the agency that we exercise at the level of self and together as teams. So given that, when we did that crosswalk, we saw very kind of neatly, especially around the tools that different practitioners brought to bear, were these 5 domains. And so the white paper tries to set out, these different domains. I'm going to quickly go through them, and then we're going to talk about what it is you guys were most interested in your survey in exploring. So the first is unleashing intrinsic motivation, and the idea here is to move from sort of the reward and punishment to the idea that why we want to do this work matters, and where that meaning and purpose for us individually comes from, our ability to exercise autonomy and agency, that those sources galvanize people's commitment to act. So mining them through, we're going to talk about public narrative, or designing actions so that those characteristics to enable intrinsic motivation to exist live in the improvement work we're actually doing, or the ability to play or celebrate, have fun like you did with Joe this morning, right? That exists in the work that we do. The second is co-design. So here, fundamental to all of this, right, are our people. And those most affected by change, or for example, in Dr. Rose's case, the nurses, technicians, surgeons, anesthesiologists taking forward the checklist, boy, they were going to have a say in designing how that happened, because just because he had an idea, he had to understand he had a bias about how this should work. And he had to map, as Joe said, the system in terms of his people, understand not only how they felt about it along that diffusion of innovation curve, but also invite them to figure out how this is going to happen. Because, as we talked about earlier, people don't want to be told. They have their own ideas about what works. So why aren't we asking them? Right? And as we map our actors, then together we craft aim statements that we're owning together, that we're not being told, but we're creating. We might have a place that we start, but this is an iterative process as we bring people on board. The third domain is around the fact that, look, this happens in human relationship. So how we show up for those relationships matters, right? I always think of you, Derek, around this, which is this humble inquiry, this idea that asking questions, listening deeply, inviting people to an appreciative inquiry, reflect on their own experiences and identify their own sources of knowledge, and use that knowledge to help them connect the dots between what they already know and what you're hoping you could do together. And doing that in one-to-one meetings where people really feel seen. They really feel heard. They feel respected. But that is a critical aspect of the work that we had to do. And you guys, by the way, scored very high on this. So I'm happy that, that this is a set of skills that it's very fundamental, obviously, to the psychology of change. The fourth domain is around distributing power. So here the idea is that, to get a lot of people on board, especially if we're going to scale change, okay, that we want to let people bring the assets that they have to bear so that it's not just buy-in, it's ownership. You talked about the surgical safety checklist, being implemented but not being implemented, not really working the way that it should. Because when you're just sort of mentally like checking the list, that's just buy-in, right? That's compliance. But when you're using the checklist because you see that you own the success and the shared purpose, that you have distributed leadership effectively within your teams, and you have norms, you have working agreements about how you're going to use that checklist and how you're going to show up together in the work, and you're okay with ceding some power, right? That the checklist, for example, would help you, deliver on a patient outcome, then now we have real ownership and distribution of mutuality in our commitment to the change, as opposed to just sort of, passively participating. The last is adapting and action. So, this is the work of improvement, right? Adaptation, PDSing, learning from experience, and as part of that, helping people adopt that growth mindset, learn to fail forward. If it takes 50 times of iterating, then that means 49 times maybe we're not doing so, we're getting there, right? But we have to learn how to live with that, and we have to be coached and supported. So there's a lot of work around the jazz, the peer learning, the learning across your teams today, right? And so this embracing of emergence and creating conditions for the adaptation to exist is another critical area of work. So again, of these, I want to invite you to reflect on where you already feel strong. Where do you already feel strong or feel like you already know some things? What are you already doing? And I really want to celebrate that, right? Congratulations, that is great. And keep going. This is what you said you were well-versed in, okay, based on the survey results. You feel highest and most comfortable in the first three, and we saw sort of a drop-off around the last two. And I also asked very specifically about some specific skills, and this was the outcomes, that you felt much more comfortable with the skills of co-producing an authentic relationship around open and honest questions, meeting one-to-one, deep listening, developing shared purpose with a team that's those are obviously super fundamental and a wonderful place to start. So let's acknowledge that we have some assets in the room that we're going to be building off of in the work that you're already doing. And you still have some curiosities too. And the one that you're most curious about is this idea of unleashing intrinsic motivation. Like, how do we really do that, okay? So we're going to have a chance to explore that together today. Distributing power is right after that. There's so much richness in the tapestry of this work that I just want to acknowledge, like, I could spend your entire immersion with you for 5 days, and we could work deeply through methods and tools that you could take forward in any of these domains. But that's not what the immersion program is, right? So there are other opportunities that you can join us in. Alex and I will be leading a one-day workshop, which we had the joy of participating together and doing something similar in London this past May, where we got to more deeply get into each and every one domain and explore tools and methods that could be applied and measured in your settings. So we invite you into that, but due to time today, I want to acknowledge that your survey responses were very helpful to let us get right into unleashing people's intrinsic motivation, as more than half of you being the most interested in exploring that. Okay, and of course you have the white paper to continue to explore, and we're hoping that in the future we'll be keeping you posted on more offerings from IHI if that's of use to you and your teams. So I've done the first bullet. I'm going to just take a pause there, and then the next step for us is to look at some of the practices and just try some on. And then we're going to make a choice later around how we want to do the practical application. I can later we can explore the story of the surgical safety checklist, and I can walk you through the other domains and kind of how in one story that all came together. Or we can just hear from you guys about stuff you're working on, and we can coach and look at the domains and see how together we imagine they might apply. Okay? So we'll leave that for your choice later. We always like to have some co-design on anything that's psychology of change related. So so as we get started, how's everybody feeling before I carry on? Are we good? Okay. So this is a little pop quiz, and I will know who read the white paper based on this answer. What is the one word that I'm most concerned with in the model for improvement when I talk about the psychology of change? It's the smallest word. Oh, that is the smallest word, but it's the second smallest word. It's we. It's we. And what I want to just note, and I do feel like I'm speaking heresy every time I say this, but maybe it's just our psychology about change, right? That we can't have an aim for improvement without a we. We are taking for granted in the model for improvement that to have an improvement starts with people, starts with a reason to have an improvement and the people who want to drive that, right? So we have to pay exquisite attention to the we in order to develop our aims and our measures, to test our change. And so I just want to note that the other word that is not in the model, but we're going to now take a good look at, is the word why. Why does it matter at all? Why did the we gather to try to accomplish this in the first place? These are two assumptions kind of that sit below the model for improvement that we have to take seriously if we're thinking about psychology. And so the first is in unleashing intrinsic motivation, we want to think about, first of all, as Joe and his partner in crime, Becky Margiata, would suggest, unleashing is the idea that we actually want to lose control of our teams across our systems in moving this work forward, but we want to unleash, what we want to unleash here is intrinsic motivation. So social psychologists Richard Ryan and Edward Deci talk about intrinsic motivation as being doing something for the inherent value that engaging in the activity provides. That's different than having an incentive or a reward or trying to meet a compliance metric, etc. That the activity itself is inherently satisfying. The good news is most people get into healthcare, as we talked about in the first place, and improvement because they value things like love and human beings and care and justice. And so we have a lot of richness that we get to work with when we explore meaning and purpose. Here's the thing. It's kind of an amazing thing. This is a book by Daniel Pink. It's a great summary of a lot of research around extrinsic and intrinsic motivation. But often these do not work or cause harm. They might work for a little while, but they disconnect people from the purpose of why they're doing something. So even just like, I keep coming back to your comment about doing the checklist, but it not mattering because it's a compliance mechanism as opposed to one where we've created culture change, where we actually believe in why it works and how we want to show up in the work, and that's our shared purpose and why we come to work each day is about delivering for the patient and their safety. When we're trying to intrinsically motivate the improvement that we're seeing, we might get little bumps. But then often what happens is people also get burned out. They get disconnected from the work. They're feeling like I'm being told things. And so this is also contributing to the challenges that Jess described yesterday around joy in work, right? Because our systems have been set up and we are participating in perpetrating our own systems of extrinsic motivation in the way we design improvement work, sometimes, right? And so this has a reverse effect on people's creativity, the way they show up. And if we want a joyful, vibrant workforce, we want culture change where people are doing improvement because, boy, that feels good, right? And it's fun. And like we are delivering on those values of love and care and justice. Dan Ariely further looks at this, right? And he's at MIT, and what he connected it back to is what we started with, which was that, look, in factories, extrinsic motivation works pretty well. When it's doing the same thing over and over and over again, then, okay, bumping up the pay grade, that helps. But most of our improvement work is asking people who are taking forward the change. They have to adapt their own behavior, and that means that they need the source of intrinsic motivation to activate their agency around committing to it, advancing it, sustaining it over time, helping us spread and scale that across our systems. So we have to become expert in unleashing their intrinsic motivation. Deming knew this, right? He talked about this because he said, look, we have to limit fear. We know fear is out there. We have to find ways of limiting it. And guess what? There are so many practitioners and tools and methods that, boy, I think Deming would have been pumped if he knew about the ways we could bring some of that to bear to help people unleash intrinsic motivation, okay? Maureen, we're going to look at an example from Maureen, of course, leads a lot of this around the work that IHI and other partners across the world have been doing in the What Matters movement every June 6th. Don Berwick, as you know, is a master at narrative, right? When you hear Don Do you walk away feeling motivated and excited to be a part of the improvement community? Next time you listen to him, I think it's tomorrow, pay attention to what he does. He tells stories. Story after story after story. And what he is doing is actually rather scientific. We all have something called the amygdala in our brains, and many of you have studied that amygdala. Does anyone know what happens when so the amygdala is basically it regulates emotion, right? When your amygdala does not work, what can't you do? What can't you do? It's really interesting. You cannot choose. When confronted with choice, people with damaged amygdalas cannot choose. Do you remember courage? The emotional resources that we need to choose to act, right? What stories do is they connect us to emotion. We feel something. Think of a movie or a book that you've heard. Think of how you feel when Don speaks. You get teary. You get hopeful. You're at the edge of your seat waiting to hear what happens next. You want to know what choice is made, right? Because you feel something, and that triggers in you a feeling of emotion or motivation. And when we hear stories, that connects us to our ability to choose, right? Dan Heath talks about the rider and the elephant in the book Switch and the path, and that the elephant, right, that amygdala is controlling a lot more than we think when we are talking about very rational healthcare professionals working in evidence, right? Of course, we use our rational side of our brain, but we're really guided by this irrational side. And a way into that is through story, is to help people connect to what I'm going to introduce is public narrative, which is the story of self, us, and now. We're going to look at an example, and then we're going to invite you guys to practice with each other, a first draft, right? Our theory of knowledge for you will be getting on the bike and getting ready to fall down and fail and get back up again, right? Just like any good improver, let's get right into the practice and PDSA something together. And as we think about doing that, and invite you guys to share some of your own stories of motivation about your work in healthcare, I want to invite you to think about this framework, okay? So this comes to us from Rabbi Hillel, first century Jewish scholar. And the first question he asks is a story of ourselves. If I'm not for myself, who will be for me? Now, oftentimes we're taught in healthcare not to talk about ourselves. That we don't focus on the provider, we focus on the patient. We're focused on the work. But this is not a self-interested question. This is a self-regarding question. If we're leaders and we want people to join with us, then we need to have an accounting of who we are and what motivates us to act. You get that accounting from Don Berwick. You get that accounting from Derek Feely. You get that accounting from Maureen Bisignano, and you think, boy, those are my people. I want to join with that community. I'm here at IHI, right? And those are your people at home, too. I know you're thinking of them. And it's people who give an accounting of their values, and they're aligned with yours through the stories they tell. The second is a story of us. So this is the idea of, when I'm for myself alone, what am I? The idea here is I'm inextricably linked with others. We are interconnected as that system, right? And what you do affects my outcome, and what I do affects yours. And what I'm creating here is an identity of who we are together. And that identity group is critical in any good social movement work and any good change effort, right? Who we are together and how we know we're the ones called to do this work and get it done. Martin Luther King Jr., he did stories of self, us, and now, night after night in the Montgomery bus boycott in churches to sustain people's motivation to stay off the bus. For over a year, they walked. They created joint, ways of carpooling. And that was hard, just like your improvement work is. So being able to bring people together around staying motivated, this is a critical skill for us. And then, of course, lastly, if not well, now then, these are the adverse events, the stories we tell, and the hopeful vision of how our new idea is going to take this forward and what we're called to do. So we're going to look at an example of Maureen. And Linson, can I have some help getting this up on the computer? Maureen is going to sort of tell a story of her own call to being a leader of improvement. And what I invite you to reflect on as you listen to her story is, first, what? Oh, good. Why didn't you come in? Do you want to tell the story? I didn't know you were in the office today. Oh, Maureen, just come in. Come in. Yay! So wonderful. Yeah, totally. Yeah, you told her, didn't you? Come on up. Oh, this is just so much better.
We should just start playing and you should just start talking at the same time.
So, Maureen, I was about to, come on up. This is
Hi,
so
everybody.
Wonderful. Have you met Maureen yet this week? Oh, wow. Well, this is a wonderful way to be introduced to Maureen. Maureen, I would love to, we're going to do this live. It's like live theater. So we were just going through narrative as a practice to unleash intrinsic motivation. And I was outlining sort of the story of self, us, and now. And I was going to play your example of sharing, sort of through IHI, the story of why you got into improvement work based on the story of your brother.
Oh.
And so I wondered if you wouldn't mind sharing that story. Yeah. And then I'm going to invite folks, as they're listening, to listen for a few things. Okay?
Yeah.
The first is how you feel as you hear the story that Maureen's going to share with you. How you feel. I want you to also pay attention to when you feel first connected to Maureen in the story and how that happens. And then the questions that we just looked at, story of self, us, and now, and Maureen, because it's live theater, we may not, don't worry, you're off the hook. But think about sort of where you hear her story of self, if you feel an us being generated through the story, okay? And I won't keep you on the hook for now, because we'd just love for you to
Great.
go for it.
Do you have any pictures of my brother?
In the video, I do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So, welcome everybody, and this was just serendipity. I dropped off some papers and walked by and saw myself, so I thought I should poke my head in. I did get started in healthcare improvement, thinking about improvement through a systems lens a long time ago. I'm the oldest of 9 kids, so I have a huge family, big Irish family. Anybody have more than 9 in their family? No? So everybody Sunday will come to my house for an annual celebration, and there are 51 in my immediate family. That's us. But the third of the family was my brother Johnny, and you'll see a picture of him. He was a gorgeous kid, really smart, kind, and loving and gentle. He was the ball boy for the Boston Celtics. Tremendous. And when he was 17, he was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease. And he used to come up to my apartment. I was a young nurse at the time. And he used to come up to my apartment all the time. And he'd say, Mo, that's what they call me. He'd say, Mo, I'm not going to make it. And I thought, as a young nurse, that my job was to give him hope and to let him know that there's another round of chemo or we can do more radiation therapy. And so I used to always think that my role as a sister and as a nurse was to encourage him and to encourage him not to give up. He was in the hospital, and you'll see the picture of him in the hospital here in Boston when he was 20 years old. And the doctors came in to make rounds like they did at the time. They stood around the bed, and they all talked over him. And decided what they were going to do. And then they left, and I was sitting next to my brother, and one of the doctors came back in, and he said to my brother, he said, Johnny, what do you want? And my brother said, I want to go home. And the doctor walked over to me, and he didn't say a word, but he took my jacket off me, and he put it on my brother, and he picked my brother up, and he carried him out to my car, with nurses screaming after him down the hall, you can't do that. He wasn't his primary doctor. He was a radiation oncologist. But he carried him out to my car, and that question changed everything for me. When I got my brother home, I said, Johnny, what do you want? And he said, I want to be 21. And he turned 21 on November 25th, and then he died on December 1st. But those last weeks at home were amazing. We had all his friends in. We began to talk about what was happening to him. So he could say goodbye and do all the things that he wanted to. Everybody in the family, even the littlest sister, had a role. Her job was to put cream on his feet. So 3 times a day, this little kid would come in and put cream on his feet, and she knew she was taking care of him. Those last weeks were amazing. If he had to die in the hospital, which would have happened, we did have our tricks. The family would hear the footsteps coming down the hallway, and we got to stand behind the door. So when the door opened, we would just be quiet behind the door, and the person would come in and do whatever and then leave. But the rules were that my littlest sisters and brothers couldn't come in to visit. They were too young. His friends couldn't come in. So that doctor's question, Johnny, what do you want, totally changed everything for him, for my whole family. And it led me on to a different way to think about my career. It wasn't just me going in and doing what I professionally knew to do. It was a whole different way of thinking, which led to, I think, a lot of cultural changes. And now people asking, according to Susan Edgman-Levitan and Michael Barry, not only what's the matter, but what matters to you. And we're starting to see this spread around the world now. On June 6th every year is What Matters to You Day. And this year on June 6th, 35 countries, 23 million people mentioning what matters to you in tweets, thousands of organizations around the world. And at least in my heart, it started with that doctor who had the courage to say, what do you want? And then to pick up my brother and bring him to my car.
Yay, thank you, Marie. I really appreciate it. This was amazing. You just talk fast.
I know, it was just...
Thank you. Can you stay with us for just a minute?
Yeah, if you take my picture.
Okay. Linton, can you help us move back to the slides, please? Thank you.
We don't need to do anymore.
Exactly. So much better, right? The person to person. So let's just hear from you about debriefing what you heard. And obviously, there's the sanctity of the story itself. We're also, with your permission, Maureen, using this as a teaching tool to explore the method of what Maureen just did, right? As a tool for us. So when did you first feel something yourself in hearing Maureen's story? When did you kind of feel electrified or connected?
She had me at hello. Just coming in the room and being part of the generosity of the
Yes, right. We learned something immediately about the types of leaders of this wonderful organization. What about in the story itself? Yes?
She said that she was a sister.
She was a sister. She was one of 9, right? And why do you think that connected with you?
Because I am a sister and my sister also has a colon condition.
Yeah, thank you. Right, so immediately connecting to us on the basis of our humanity, of some of our most fundamental identities and our most universal identities, right? Which we often can keep kind of out of the pristine culture of delivery of healthcare. What else? Where else did you feel connected?
You can empathize having a family member in the hospital, feel like you immediately go to that experience yourself.
Yeah, so she's painting a picture of Johnny in the hospital and her family there and herself there with him, painting a picture of that. And you're experiencing in your own internal landscape a similar universal experience, right? But she didn't just say, my brother was in the hospital. She used craft. She painted a picture of him in the bed, the doctors coming in, speaking over him, right? Standing off to the side, being ignored, not having a say. The doctor who came in and removed her coat, and you could feel the coat being moved onto Johnny. Walking down the hall, people running after him, right? These details are not insignificant in the craft of story. It's like any good book or movie. When you feel something, and if your job is to motivate people to feel, then craft is critical here, okay? So just paying attention to the beautiful storytelling that Maureen is, very adept at as a both a skill and just as a human practice that we all know something about. Yes, go ahead.
I think when you said that you thought your job was to make you feel better, that's the insight for me as a personal journey. That's where I get thinking about it.
So having that shared challenge, right? So we talked about the narrative structure is one of challenge, choice, and outcome. So in her story of self, of what motivates her, we heard around that challenge is what you just identified, which is, I thought this is what my job was. This is what I was supposed to do, right? That's one challenge. What was another challenge you heard in the story?
A little bit of helplessness about, so how do I do that given this environment?
Right, so just the typical norms of the healthcare system and what was expected was a big challenge.
I think you just said there's that moment of change, which is so powerful. Yeah. All the signs of storytelling, it's kind of thesis looks like any with all this plot, there's moments of change that, and that's really what I'm in this story. Like he's doing something, the doctor's suddenly changing the whole narrative of the situation. There's this moment which suddenly makes you go, what's happening there?
That's right. That leaning in of what's going to happen next to Johnny, right? What's going to happen? And the doctor makes a choice to ask a very different question. Johnny, what do you want? And not only does he ask the question, he then responds to the answer. And he makes a second courageous choice to act with courage to get Johnny home in light of all the rules that he's broken, right? And we know the outcome. Maureen has described it, what it was like to have Johnny at home, right? That choice resulted in something really positive for herself, for Johnny, for the family. Right? And we felt very connected to that story structure. So when you think about your own stories and you think about your own sources of motivation for the work, and it's okay that, Maureen has given this some thought, and this is a very clear story for her that she's told more than once. But, for you, we're inviting you to explore sources and choice points. She didn't tell sort of her whole life history as becoming a nurse and an improver and working with Don and, helping build the IHI and leading it and so on. No. She honed in on a moment. And so one of the hardest things is the selection of mining ourselves. The good news is, though, that we have a lifetime, a Rolodex of stories, right? So part of it is just searching for it. And what we find is when we start telling stories with others on our teams, hearing Maureen, is that the stories themselves start stimulating in you reminders of where some of that lives. And so by sharing story at the start of an improvement huddle around why the work matters or why we care about what we do, it's a great way to build some intrinsic motivation quickly around, why we're sticking with this improvement work, right? Or if we're in a one-to-one with someone, we're trying to bring them on board, connecting them and eliciting from them why the work matters for them, but not just stopping when they say, well, that's why I became a doctor. But why did you become a doctor? Getting under the hood and exploring, like, who really is this person? I want to see you. I want to know you, right? What does it feel like when people explore our stories? In the co-production of authentic relationship, that builds trust. That builds a source of common value because we start to see the types of choices we make as human beings, and we see the commonalities between us that motivate us to work together. So Maureen also did a beautiful job, spontaneously, of all three, self, us, and now. Because not only did she share the story that she then had in being transformed to ask Johnny herself what he wants, but also she created in us almost immediately by talking about the doctor that was a part of that, and knowing her audience of healthcare professionals, that is in us. We're part of that us too, right? And then even just as you said, I'm an us as a sister or as a family member that has someone in a hospital, right? So us is being created around our shared values, who we could be together to make these types of hopeful choices. And then Maureen did not stop. She then introduced us to the What Matters to You Day. That there, in fact, is a hopeful way we could exercise some of our agency right now and work within our health systems to bring to bear what matters to people, along with the science of improvement, to get something done around what we really see as being possible. What matters to us as staff and as patients and in those partnerships, right?
Just to close, I was at Logan Airport about 6 or 7 months ago, and my husband and I were sitting in the airport, and all of a sudden I looked up, and there was the doctor and his wife. And all these years, 35 years later, the two of us jumped up and ran across, and we're hugging each other with our spouses saying, what is this? And we immediately reconnected on that moment when he had the courage to ask the question and then to act on it. And all these years later, we've not seen each other. It was just an instant of reflection on what a difference that guy made in so many lives.
Thank you, Maureen. Maureen, thank you so much for dropping in to be with us. What a treat. So we want you now to just take some time. I'm going to give you like 3 minutes just for quiet reflection. Quiet reflection to think about sort of your own internal landscape around story. And then we're going to have you just partner with one other person. So not as a table, just find one other person that you can sit with and you can share your story, and you can then in turn, have your partner share his or her story and spend a little time exploring story. Okay, so 3 minutes quiet reflection, and then I'll let you know when to pair up. Partner with someone, just a chance to share a sort of a first draft, and again, inviting you to kind of experience your own courage and the emotional resources it's going to take to share a story, and then also so we can hone our power and ability to get good at it, right? So why don't we take about 10 minutes to share, or maybe 4 minutes per person to share stories. We're just going to give you about 2 more minutes, so if you haven't taken the other turn, please do. Okay, I'm going to call our attention back. Thank you all for getting on the bike. I hope it wasn't too wobbly. I hope it felt pretty natural for some of you. If you didn't get a chance to share your story, following this session, it will be lunch. So I'd love for you to commit to the person on your team or in your partnership to continue sharing stories with one another today and throughout the rest of Immersion so that you can get better at it and you can also hear one another's stories and connect to different sources of motivation across this community. It's one way we build community. So what did it feel like? What was your experience? What were some insights in working on story and exploring somebody else's?
I think it's good to connect to purpose. I think it's very good to connect to purpose. It revitalizes you as to why you do it.
It does. And you know, when we're talking about how hard improvement work is, boy, is it important to do that for ourselves, let alone for everyone else, right? That in fact is a form of self-care that we can infuse in the work.
Can I
Yeah.
at the risk of sharing? So a few years ago, my dad died in the hospital because of a medical error. His death was kind of expedited.
Sorry.
And, you know, part of it was lack of communication. The nurses knew a test was done, the lab wasn't whatever, the usual one of those stories. So the part that I struggle with is, and I know the comparisons between airlines and whatever it's done too much. But if I heard that an airline is working on getting buy-in so that the pilots that is flying my plane will do checklists before we fly. I'm gonna never fly on that plane, and I'm gonna leave right there and then. So the idea that I struggle with, and I say, thou shalt do check-ins and surgical check-ins starting tomorrow, and if you don't, you're gonna be fired, and I'll personally walk you out of this hospital. Bear with me. It's like how many patients is it okay to subject them to this change? And you know, to me, it's a little bit like, I get it. Like as surgeons, we're all supposed to wash our hands beforehand. I know for a fact some do it for 3 minutes the way they're supposed to. Some do it for a minute. And I'm sort of saying, well, a minute is better than 0. And where is that line that I can say, you know, and this is the part I struggle with, is that the HCAHPS, patient satisfaction, if the nurse doesn't smile or doctor doesn't communicate, maybe directly doesn't kill a patient, maybe. But a lack of surgical check-ins can sort of really harm people right there and then. And probably there are tons of similar things, you know, that how can I wait for this cultural change, and why not set up a rule And in the meantime, show people that it's actually the right thing to do.
Yeah. What is your name?
Eden.
Eden, thank you for sharing, first of all, your story, and also this very important question that you're wrestling with, and I suspect many people in their own settings are wrestling with when we see harm and we sometimes walk past it, and what that does to us, and also how to deal with that in our work. And I would ask, what do you think?
So I've shared my story, and after a while, it's painful for me to share every time I do, and especially if sometimes I feel I overdo it, because it's one thing if I went around the world and shared it maybe, but once people hear it a few times, I don't know, I feel I cheapen it sometimes, or I don't know if it has the same value again. But I think that the culture change definitely needs to happen, but those things that I have to make that judgment on a case by case, that this is one of those red lines that I just cannot let go. Do you know what I mean?
I do.
Yes.
Yeah, and I think that just in sharing that part of your story tells us a lot about who you are and the types of choices that you make. Certainly motivates me to want to know you better. Motivates me as I'm listening to want to join you in the work that you do, right? Just, I feel connected to the story that you told, but also to the dilemmas that you're raising, that are shared dilemmas. There's an us, right? There's an us around those dilemmas, and figuring out the answers to them. When you heard, I'm sorry, Eden, when you heard Eden pose this challenge to us, did you have an answer in your mind as you were listening? I want to reflect on our own experience of just engaging in the challenge that you've addressed.
I would just make a comment that just my experience of again, the power of that story, because if I was someone working with you who told me the story, I think I'd be much more likely to change my behaviour. And so I just think it'd be interesting how that, of course, everyone should be washing their hands, doing the checklist, it's the evidence is there. But again, if you, I think just increases the likelihood that by sharing that story, that someone will behave differently.
Thank you. Yeah, and Simon, do you want to add?
I think you're also flagging a difference there between, you're saying typically I'd be really happy to negotiate about this, but for this, there is a red line. So you're actually giving people that context, or it's me, you're giving people that context about what your usual, what business as usual is to you, and why this is not good, why this is different, why this is a different case.
But in posing the question, you also created a sense of agency. Instead of telling us all what we had to now do, you said, I'm wrestling with this. And we as your audience are listening and saying, well, boy, how would I respond to that? Or, here's how I would advise you, or how I would want to fix it. Now, I could have, as the expert at the front of the room, said, here's what I think you should do. You pose the question, let me fix that problem for you, right? The psychology of change methods would invite us, when somebody poses that type of challenge to us, to resist that urge to fix. And instead to remember that it's not a technical, what you posed was not a technical problem. That was adaptive. And the person to solve that is not me, it's you. And my work is to partner with you and help you figure out what you think the answer to that is, right? So I turned the question back. And I did that on purpose, and I wanted to just be very explicit about modeling that to you, because it's an important part of how we co-produce solution and activate agency. Back to Eden. Back to Eden about how, what he could do, right? And then it poses a question to all of us to activate our agency around the same question. So I think also by asking us a question instead of telling us and sharing with us the dilemma underneath it, that might be a powerful way to engage people in your system. That you're human and vulnerable, and you're inviting them into the vulnerability around that. And people do want to care for you and solve this problem with you. Right? So thank you for that great example. So this is the power story, right? And we invite you to continue to learn about it. I'm going to provide some resources at the end for how you can do that. I'm going to just pause because we have about 25 minutes. When do we end? 25 minutes? So I want to give you some choice. We have 3 options. Door number 1 is we can stick with unleashing intrinsic motivation, and we can move from the heart work to some head work about how to design improvement work in ways that will intrinsically motivate, simply through the ways in which we strategize the design of the work. Okay, that's option 1. That would be like another skill like we just did, and we'll just explore through one case example, a live example. Simon's going to bring it to us. Second choice would be that we can either go back to the surgical safety checklist, and I can explain how that works and go through the bunch of slides and just sort of like walk you through the rest of the framework and how in a story it comes to life. Okay, so you can kind of see the arc. And third is we just dump it and we just start talking about, either at our tables or with me, we do some live cases of just stuff you're facing and how the framework could apply. So I'm going to give you those 3 options again, and you're going to vote. 1 is to look at motivational task design and stick with another tool. 2 is to look at an example in the surgical safety checklist and see the arc of the whole framework, and that'll be more didactic. And 3 is to just take some live stuff that you're facing and explore how the framework might apply. So option 1, how many people want to look at motivational task design and dig into another tool? Okay. Option 2, the narrative, the checklist, a little more storytelling. Okay, a couple. And then your real life challenges and just workshopping them. Okay, I'm sorry for the option 3 folks and 2 folks, but I think option 1 of looking at motivational task design we're going to stick with. Thank you for that. I hope we didn't go with consensus. We went with democratic society here, so thank you for that. That, by the way, how we make decisions is a part of distributing power, right? Every time a decision is made, our choice in our teams about how decisions happen really matters. So we have to pay attention to that when we're distributing power. Yeah?
Ask one favor. You went through that little situation so fast. I really couldn't.
This one here?
With asking you these questions.
Oh,
the questions you just asked.
These?
Like for him, like you were asking, like how that makes you feel. So can you just?
Oh, sure.
Because I like to kind of get that down to memory.
Actually, do you know we are recording this entire session, and this is going to go out to you, so you can dig right back in, and that way we can kind of keep going. But you'll have access to that, and that might be a nice way of. Okay, great. Thank you, Linson. So, the next tool that we're going to explore. This is a little bit more for the few folks that felt a little wobbly on the hard stuff. You might feel a little more comfortable on the head stuff, right? So this work comes to us from Richard Hackman and Gary Oldham. They are organizational psychologists out of Harvard. Richard Hackman's work is like this is actually back in the 70s. It is as profoundly true today as it was then, and anything by that man I consider to be just an enormous resource to the field of organizational psychology and how teams can work together effectively. Sort of like predates the Amy Edmondsons and Ruth Wagemans of the world. He's just a phenom. If you're not familiar with his work, I highly recommend it. But early in his work, dedicating his life to understanding what makes teams work together effectively was this exploration of the design of work itself. And what he and Gary Oldham discovered was that, look, if we want these things, we want high internal work motivation from our staff. We want high quality work performance. We want high satisfaction with the work, and we want low absenteeism and turnover, right? So from a system level, boy, like that matters to us if we're CEOs or if we're even middle managers. We want to design for this, right? And the good news is that we can support the creation of psychological states that leads to those outcomes. The meaningfulness, experienced responsibility, true responsibility, like I own that checklist responsibility, and knowledge of the actual results, right? So that there's a learning system. Those things generate these outcomes. So what does it take to create these psychological states in the work? What conditions can we put into the improvement work itself? Great news for us. There are some criteria, core job dimensions that we can look at how we've designed the work, and we can ask ourselves how to improve the design to be more motivational, to generate these psychological states in there for these outcomes. So we're going to take an example. And Simon kindly volunteered, or voluntold, I'm not sure, but to share the improvement work he's working on. I'm going to ask him to share it in just a moment, but what I would love for you to do before he does is I would invite you to think about the improvement work you're leading, or that someone in your system is leading that you're supporting. And I want you to hone in on what is the actual design of the behavior change that staff are being asked to take. Okay? And we're going to look at Simon's example, but as we do, imagine in your own example how these same principles apply. Okay? And hopefully you'll see some juice. So go ahead, Simon, tell us a little bit, if you wouldn't mind standing up. We'll get maybe a mic for you somewhere. Is there a mic? Oh, I think Linson just left. Here, tell me a little bit about, because they're recording, so tell me a little bit about your work.
Thank you. So for those of you who haven't met me, my name's Simon Paget. I'm a pediatrician and what you call a physiatrist here as well. And so this project work is right at sort of the beginning of its right at the beginning stage, and it's around my specialist field, which is looking after kids with cerebral palsy. So cerebral palsy, as many of you will know, is the most common cause of physical disability in children. About 2 for every 1,000 children that are born in the Western world are born with cerebral palsy. And so the issue is around preventing a common complication of cerebral palsy, which is hip dislocation. So for kids with severe CP, they're at high risk of developing hip dislocation during childhood. And so a few years ago, there was a guideline that was brought around surveillance for hip assessment, largely involving an X-ray at regular intervals to actually determine whether the child was developing hip dislocation over time, which would allow an early intervention procedure. So that's a surgical procedure, but nonetheless a much more successful surgical procedure. And so I guess the issue is, like these, I live in New South Wales, which is, I've just looked up, about 300,000 square miles, and with a population of about 8 million, and so several thousand, probably 5,000 or so children with CP there, whose job is it to do the surveillance. So there's some guidelines there. But whose job is it to enact those guidelines? And so particularly in the context of the geography, these kids live all over New South Wales. And so
tell us a little bit about the change, the actual improvement that you would like to see the providers or whomever in the systems make to support the prevention of this.
Thank you. So I guess the broad change is I would like all children in New South Wales with cerebral palsy to have appropriate hip surveillance. And the change I would like to see is for a large collaborative group decide what the best mechanism would be for that, and for us to then reorganise the health service to provide that service.
Beautiful. And so then one test of that change could be?
The test of
pediatricians, or
absolutely a pediatrician, or a primary, like a general practitioner or a family physician, and of course it's going to involve maybe like a radiology services as well, and then and also the families. I mean, again, so there's got to be some mechanism of doing this regularly and then feeding back about what the result means. So
brilliant. Okay, so this is a change that Simon is we're going to keep engaging with you, but you can sit down. Thank you, Simon, for this example. So Simon has not yet gotten to the point of doing some PDSAs around it. So this is great because we can support him together right now in thinking about how to design some of that testing work. And we're just going to come up with one imaginary way for now. But when he does it, he can actually look at what the design is and see whether those 5 criteria for motivational tactics are there, and we can help him improve it. So Simon, what I heard you say as a starting point for this exploration is that a pediatrician, as a test of change, what we're asking them to do is, when confronted with a patient with cerebral palsy, to order a preventative radiology X-ray of the hips, and to evaluate with radiologist whether that child is at risk and needing preventative surgery. Correct? Okay, so let's just say that the first test of change is to work with a pediatrician around integrating that into his or her practice. Okay, pretty similar probably to what many of you are doing with different stakeholders in your improvement work. There's something you're asking them now to do differently. And so let's look at whether there's action identity in that task. So the pediatrician is going to see the child and decide whether to order the x-ray or not, and order the x-ray and evaluate it. So through that, have we completed the task from start to finish? If we were to raise this on a 1 to 10, what would we give that? Like that same stakeholder gets to do the action from the start all the way through. Is it more than just the pediatrician? Yeah, right, because there's a radiologist too. And maybe there's also a technician, right? So suddenly it's there's different pieces that different members of the health system are engaged in, and so we might think about what part of the action is each person participating in, and are they completing that from start to finish, and how can they see the whole action identity, the part that they're responsible for, but also the other stakeholders, and increase that so it's not as siloed. It's much more interprofessional and understood. This one's pretty straightforward in that regard, but the idea is that people need to see the whole action and how they're a part of it. The second is the significance. So, okay, so I'm a pediatrician and I see, 1,000 kids in a year. And let's say 50 of them, I'm totally off on numbers, have cerebral palsy. So what, right? Do you remember when Joe was talking about the math and breaking things up into pieces and showing people what part they're responsible for? This is what we're talking about in action significance. So what we're trying to do here is help the pediatrician see, if I do this with the 50 patients I see a year that have this condition, then here's what's going to happen in terms of outcomes. And then if I do this and everyone else in New South Wales who's a pediatrician is doing this, here's collectively, or let's just back that up, everyone else in my practice does this. And then everyone else, all of my GPs in my system do this. And then across our systems, across New South Wales, we do this. Then what does that add up to see the difference? Because a lot of times we feel like walking past the surgeon who's only washed his hands for a minute, right? Or we have the next patient waiting, I don't have time to deal with this x-ray, the kid looks fine, right? This is the daily stuff that we encounter. This is where the sources of resistance come from. And so helping people understand the significance of why each and every patient matters, and to do that math, help them see, even within their own system, in that month, in that week, in that day, right? How to chunk out the difference that they make and show them that also through use of story. So the data and the story to create action significance, okay, for high level of motivation. So that we can go from, well, I'm told I'm supposed to do this, to, oh, I see why this matters. I'm connected to it. One of my favorite patients, et cetera, et cetera. The next one is skill variety. So, okay, so if this action is chunked out between the pediatrician, the radiologist, and the technician, maybe somebody's putting this in the chart, whoever, is there a lot of variety for each one of those folks, or is there just one very clear piece that they're responsible for? People are motivated like when they're not having to be factory workers. So the way that we design how people work together actually really matters, and how we set up skill variety in the work. Now, some of that might feel rather challenging, like how could I change the entire system of how these players work together, right? But let's just get with teams and get creative about the ways in which we could make that engaging for the providers or for the technicians and so on, and thinking about the ways in which they could maybe increase the way in which they talk to the patient or family about it, the way in which they talk to each other about it. There's lots of skills, adaptive skills, that are going into this whole process, and just getting really explicit about what they are so that people can see that they have places to play with how they want to bring about the next step, which is autonomy. The more skill variety that there is, the more opportunity we have to make choice about how to do the work, right? So we know the evidence, you shared the evidence with us, but there's going to be all kinds of tests of change to get to how this works best for any specific pediatrician or their practice or their team or their health system or the GPs there. And even in one place, as you spread it to the next, we need to create room for that adaptation that Joe talked about, that choice. We hold tight to, we want the x-ray, we want to review it. Everything else, it's okay to play with. There's not one specific prescriptive way. There's some guidelines, you know, but let's give people some agency to figure out what's going to work in their setting. Same thing with the surgical safety checklist. And then the feedback, this is what we do in improvement, right, is create visible results immediately about the difference that this makes to a child or to a family, the stories of adverse events, of not catching it soon enough, the visible results of having intervened and being able to make a difference in that child and family's life, reducing costs, gathering, you know, of course, all kinds of data around, you know, things that might matter to other members of this larger system, around the reduction of waste, around improved productivity, whatever it is in your improvement setting. So thinking about how to build those criteria into the way in which you set up the action itself generates more motivation from the people participating in the action to, again, create these psychological states in the design of the work. And it doesn't have to be done in a non-transparent way. These are conversations we can have with our teams of improvers about how to build that into the work. So I'm not suggesting like behavioral economics go behind the, you know, curtain of Oz and, you know, don't be transparent about the design. No. We're talking about agency. That means we're talking about choice. And that means we're sharing with people what we're talking about when we do it, right? So they have the choice. We're not manipulating. We're not coercing. We're just being clear that this is part of the design of the work. Okay, so this is just another tool, and we're going to give you the paper that this came out of so that you can go back to that and really explore each of these dimensions and think about how to design your work, your team's improvement work, to build this in. Okay? So I think with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to skip really fast through a whole bunch of slides that are there for you. Okay? And all of this is just to tell the story of the surgical safety checklist. You, however, can get a little freebie. We published with Mike Rose an HBR article in May describing some of the mindsets that we talked about today through his story. So you are more than welcome to look at that as a resource to you. But before we go, I just wanted to take a minute. I know we only looked at two things today, story and motivational task design. But I just wouldn't feel right being here at IHI if I didn't challenge all of us to think of one way you might apply one of those skills, maybe even today, in your work together, here as a community of improvers in Immersion, or in your work at home when you go back. I'm going to just give you a minute. If you could just raise your hand, if you can imagine one way that you could apply either story or motivational task design to your work. Yeah, just keep your arms up just so I can kind of get a sense of. Great, thank you. I really asked for your commitment around doing that and sharing that result back with someone else you've met here today. And not only to do it, but to measure it. Because what I want to invite you to think is this is just like a run chart. This is just like you know, any other tool that you've been using in the science of improvement, that these are methods that themselves can be measured and improved in terms of the impact that they have on the improvement work that you lead. And we take them for granted. We think this is just the stuff we do. In fact, no. There is skill and there's practice. And so I invite you to consider if you have, as a baseline, for example, never used story in your improvement work, and you suddenly introduce that to start seeing whether you're getting more energy and momentum from your teams to adopt the improvement you seek, for instance. And whether you're seeing any other secondary measures about maybe higher discretionary effort or increased joy in connecting to people's sources of motivation. We can measure this, and we know this stuff matters to our health systems. It matters to our patients, and certainly it matters to our staff. So thinking about how we measure what we do on the human side of change actually is pretty critical. Here's an example. If we want to look at whether we're more effectively activating people's agency by the types of psychological human side of change methods we're using, we might measure whether people feel able to contribute their knowledge and skills on the improvement team to advance the shared purpose. Have you activated their agency using these tools, right? You can measure this across your system. And for any one of the sets of tools that you use, you can create any type of Likert scale measure, and of course, harvest stories and other observational data and feedback as part of thinking about how to bring to bear the psychology of change tools. And of course, we always invite you to think about practicing the psychology of change in measurement. As Joe noted, one real source of resistance is measurement. And so thinking about applying the human side of change tools to help people want to measure, to activate their agency to measure with you is also critical, right? So we can kind of do a meta on that one too. So that's the framework. I really thank you for your attention. I want to leave you with a few things. One, I'm going to give you this playlist, which you can play with your teams. This has been co-created by improvers like you around songs that activate their agency. So these are things like, what a feeling, da-da, da-da-da. And there's actually a ton of folks from the UK like went crazy on this. There's like really UK rock going on, and some folks from Brazil. So it's totally global. So you can play this with your teams and have fun and create like cultures and environments of, happy human, creation of change. I also want to share with you this website, IHI.org/psychology is kind of the home base for the various pieces that we have produced on the psychology of change, blogs. I invite any of you, if you're working with any of these tools and you want to explore that with IHI, write a blog. We'll help you get it up and post it from this website and share it with the IHI community. And we will be following up with a workshop at the forum that'll be a full day of exploring each of the domains more in depth and the practices engaged in the domain. So if you're able to join us, we invite you. If members of your teams are able to join us because they're coming, we'd love to have them join us. And Alex and I, and actually Dr. Rose, whose work around the surgical safety checklist, he'll be helping bring that to life. And then last, I just wanted to offer many of the tools that I'm introducing to you here are embedded in a program that we teach at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement called Leadership and Organizing for Change. And that starts again in September. It's an 8-week program. And people have improvement projects, and we do things like motivational task design and storytelling, building relationships, distributing power, thinking about how to create conditions for teams to work together effectively, et cetera. So that might be available to you, or again, members of your systems that you're working with who you think could benefit from some of these practices. And so finally, I just want to, turn to you guys, give you some high fives. If you could high five your neighbor. Thank you for your attention. Good luck on the human side of change. Simon, thank you very much. Ready? Thank you. Yeah, thanks, you guys. It was a lot of fun. Thanks. Thanks, Linson. I know I'm between you and lunch. Gotta get out of the way.